All right, so the DSM-5 also diagnoses what is called learning disorders or learning disabilities, and these are basically a kind of disorders that are not related to any particular physical disability or intellectual disability or a stressful environment. It is something that is still hindering or stopping the child from learning, and they're not because of any apparent disability that can be diagnosed otherwise. So those tend to be a little harder to diagnose because there is no explicit test out there that could just, all children can take and just help them diagnose what type of learning disability are they suffering from. And because of the fact that they present themselves, as we will see in a minute, in different ways. Again, going back to that multifinality and the concept of how does it present itself. Remediation for that type of learning disability is critical early on. So the later we wait, the more time we spend without giving that diagnosis or giving that child that label, the less the potential or the possibility to remediate and help that child. The reason why we want to catch it early is because, one, again, the brain is more flexible in the earlier years than it is later on. You have the neuroplasticity, the ability for us to readjust those patterns and those pathways, neurological pathways. Two, you've got the child who is eager to learn, wants to improve the skill, wants to belong. So the later you continue to leave the child with that disability or that inability to learn, the worse the self-esteem is going to be, and the more they feel like a failure, and their failed attempts at learning or catching up can destroy their eagerness or their wanting to learn. So earlier is better. We talk about two particular learning disabilities, and that is dyslexia and dyscalculia. Dyslexia is a very unusual difficulty with reading. So this particular disorder is again going to manifest itself in different ways. It is not the simple what comes to your mind as, flipping a word backwards, or the D is a B, or all of those superficial explanations of dyslexia. Dyslexia has to do with the child's inability to phonologically remember certain phonemes and connecting sounds and letters, and inability to spell. So they really have a problem in decoding what they are reading. So the child might be looking at a word like cat, and they are not really understanding the concept of k, k, t makes cat. A typically developing child would be looking at cat, understanding that C has a sound, A has a sound, and T has a sound, and when you blend them together, you can make that word. But a child with dyslexia has a problem processing that concept of phonics and phonemes, which is individual sounds that make up a word, and then recalling that from memory. So phonological memories of, okay, I already spelled that word into cat, now I can retrieve it and say cat when somebody asks me to read that word. It originates with speech and hearing difficulties. At one point, they thought that it had to do with inability to see. So it has a visual impairment that they can't see. That's why they can't read. No, it has nothing to do with visual processing. It has to do with speech and hearing. How do we hear the letter and the phonetic sound? Very early warning signs to catch it can be as early as 3-year-olds who might not be talking clearly or have a hard time grasping concepts such as rhymes or even simple tasks as memorizing the sounds of letters. When we do phonics in early childhood, we children leave preschool knowing that A sounds like ah, and B is b. These are all things that can be red flags for teachers to catch if they see their child is having an exceptionally hard time grasping those concepts. This is an example of what a person with dyslexia might be seeing when they look at a typical text. To them, it is just like reading another language. It takes time for them to process and decode where does one word end and where does the other one start. So it takes time for them to read that this is one, this is day, John, and the letters that are jumping up and down and flipped is also an example of what they are seeing and processing as they are seeing those letters. So a text that doesn't look the same as what we see in a typically developing brain. Now, there are ways to help children with dyslexia, and it has to do with, again, retraining the brain to decode and differentiate and memorize those words and look at them technically kind of like a picture that is kind of embedded in their memory of what the word one looks like. So retraining the brain to gain that phonological memory. The other type is related to dyslexia, and that is an unusual difficulty with math, and it's called dyscalculia. And dyscalculia is not your typical, an anxiety around math. We all have some sort of an anxiety around math, except those that are really extremely analytical. But math difficulty here is relevant to the concepts that are so simple, as in remembering that 2 and 2 is 4. A person with dyscalculia will have a hard time adding simple numbers or subtracting simple numbers or understanding the concept of quantity and estimating and that 3 is less than 13, and that 2 is a representation of 2 items. So these symbolic representations are hard concepts for them to grasp, and it goes to a point where it becomes a dysfunctional concept of their life because we use math on a daily basis. Important thing to note is that often dyslexia and dyscalculia are comorbid. They do kind of exist together sometimes. So if one is diagnosed with one, chances are they might be diagnosed for the other. So what does the system in the United States do for a child that might need special education? Knowing that about 13% of all school children actually do receive special education, what does it take to get that diagnosis? Well, legally, every child must be given what is called the least restrictive environment for them to learn. So an LRE is a legal requirement that children with special needs be assigned to the most general educational context that there is to help them learn. So the least restrictive, meaning that I cannot take them and put them in a classroom that is full of children with special needs, if that child can otherwise thrive or function in a room that might be full of children of his age or her age with the help of an aid or with the help of intervention. Response to intervention is an educational strategy that teaches all children a specific skill. All right, so the teacher is going to introduce, let's say, the multiplication table, and then children are going to be tested on the multiplication table. And then if that child did not master that skill, they can receive what is called intervention. Intervention is that remediation that I'm going to get in and give that child, adjust the the environment for that child to learn the multiplication table, and then I'm going to test them again. So usually you would get about 6 weeks of regular education, and then another 6 weeks with intervention. And then after that period, if the child was not able to still achieve that skill, did not respond to intervention, then I can refer him to what is called special needs testing. And that is usually conducted by a specialist, like an educational psychologist. If the educational psychologist tests that child and gives him a diagnosis, then the parent is going to be called in, and the teachers and the therapist and the psychologists are all going to meet together and produce what is called an individual educational plan, or an IEP, which is basically a plan to help the child's education, or how it's a plan to with goals and process of how can we remediate or help or intervene to help the child. So this document will specify the goals and the plan of action, and will be revisited every once in a while to update or to see where do we stand in the process of achieving those goals.